In a world where casual racism often hides behind smiles and laughter, two friends are about to learn that their assumptions can cost them more than they ever anticipated. Kyle and Jake, confident in their everyday lives, think they've mastered the art of navigating social situations, especially when it comes to their black friend, David. But when a simple family dinner invitation turns into an uncomfortable dilemma, they choose to make excuses instead of facing their discomfort head-on. What they don't know is that this decision will set off a chain of events that will expose their deep-seated prejudices in the most public and humiliating way possible. They think they've dodged a bullet by skipping the dinner, but soon they'll be standing face to face with the man they unknowingly insulted. And he's far more powerful than they could have imagined. As they scramble to save face, the cracks in their friendship with David grow wider, and they're forced to confront their own biases in a way they never expected. This isn't just another story about awkward social missteps. It's about how the simplest choices can reveal the ugliest truths, and how sometimes the price of ignorance is higher than anyone could have anticipated. Stay with us, because the twist you're about to witness will change everything. It was a Friday afternoon when David invited his friends Kyle and Jake over for dinner. The three of them were sitting around the break room at work, munching on sandwiches, when David casually brought it up. "Hey, you guys should come over to my place tomorrow night," David said, wiping some mustard off his chin. "My family's having a big dinner, and I thought it'd be fun for you guys to join. My mom's cooking her famous mac and cheese." Kyle and Jake exchanged a glance. It wasn't the first time David had invited them over, but every time he extended the offer, they somehow managed to dodge it. This time, though, they were caught off guard. They hadn't prepared their usual stockpile of excuses. Jake, the more jittery of the two, was the first to respond. "Oh man, I think I have to help my cousin move," he said, nodding as if convincing himself. "Yeah, she's, moving into her new apartment this weekend." "Big family thing, you know how it is." David raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "You said she just moved last month." Kyle, catching the crack in Jake's excuse, quickly jumped in. "You know how women are with apartments," he said with a chuckle, trying to steer the conversation away from Jake's blunder. "She probably didn't like the view or something. Happens all the time, right, Jake?" Right, Jake added quickly. "The view, yeah." David didn't buy it, but he played along, not wanting to make things awkward, at least not yet. He turned his attention to Kyle, who was uncharacteristically quiet. "What about you, Kyle? You free?" Kyle's eyes darted to his sandwich as if it held the answer. After an awkward pause, he blurted out, "I think I'm allergic to something." He waved his hand vaguely, like the idea of allergens floated in the air around him. "I mean, I'm not sure what's on the menu, but, I've been having these reactions lately. Probably best to avoid anything too spicy." David blinked, fighting the urge to laugh. Kyle had been to every potluck the office had ever hosted, scarfing down all kinds of dishes without a single sneeze or sniffle. "Mac and cheese isn't exactly spicy, man," David said, amused. "Plus, I'm sure my mom could whip up something basic if you're really that worried about it." Kyle's face reddened, realizing his excuse was falling apart quicker than Jake's. "It's not just that. I've got this thing with dairy. Real sensitive stomach, you know." He patted his belly for emphasis, trying to look serious. David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "So, you've got a mysterious dairy allergy that's never shown up at the office, and Jake's cousin is moving for the second time in 2 months. Got it." There was a pause, the awkwardness hanging in the air like a cloud. Kyle and Jake exchanged another glance, the kind that said, "We're in over our heads, man." "Listen," David continued, his tone friendly but pointed, "it's not a big deal if you guys don't want to come. Just say you're not comfortable. No need for the grand excuses." Kyle and Jake shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable. Of course, they weren't going to admit that they felt weird about hanging out with David's family. It wasn't that they didn't like David. They considered him their friend after all. But when it came to spending time outside of work, especially with his family, the differences between them felt like a big, unspoken thing. The kind of unspoken thing that's way too hard to admit out loud, Jake thought to himself. He flashed back to how their friendship had started. It was about a year ago when David had joined the company. Kyle and Jake were part of the same team, and when David had been assigned to work with them, it wasn't long before the three started hanging out at lunch, swapping jokes and complaining about their boss. At first, everything seemed cool. David was funny, laid back, and great at his job. The fact that he was black, it wasn't something Kyle and Jake thought too much about. They weren't the racist types, after all. They'd even joked to each other that they were woke enough to have a black friend now, like it was some badge of honor. But as time went on, the cracks started to show. Like the time they all went to happy hour after work and David talked about attending a Black Lives Matter rally, and Kyle made an awkward joke about all lives matter, expecting it to land. It didn't. Or when Jake had tried to compliment David's haircut by saying, "It's so cool how your hair just does that naturally." David had laughed it off, but something in the way he smiled told Jake he'd messed up. Still, they never really talked about it. They kept things surface level, sticking to work and casual hangouts. But now, with this dinner invitation, all those little unspoken tensions were bubbling to the surface. David could see right through them, of course. He wasn't blind to their discomfort, but he was used to this kind of thing. He'd had plenty of friends like Kyle and Jake over the years, guys who thought they were progressive just because they didn't use slurs or because they could laugh at a Dave Chappelle joke. But when it came down to truly connecting outside of work, they always found a way to back out. "Well, if either of you change your mind, you're welcome to come," David said finally, standing up and grabbing his tray. "My mom's food is pretty amazing, allergies or not." Kyle and Jake nodded, their relief palpable. "Yeah, maybe next time," Kyle said weakly, clearly hoping there wouldn't be a next time. "Totally," Jake chimed in. "Let us know how it goes." David just smiled and shook his head. "Sure thing, guys, sure thing." As he walked away, Kyle let out a low whistle. "That was close," he muttered, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah," Jake agreed, wiping the sweat off his forehead. "Dodged a bullet there." Neither of them realized just how much of a bullet they dodged, or how fast it was about to come back around. That was how it always went with Kyle and Jake. They would dance around the truth, hiding their discomfort under layers of flimsy excuses. They didn't consider themselves racist, of course. They just didn't fit in with David's family. At least, that's what they told themselves to sleep better at night. Jake turned to Kyle as David disappeared down the hall. "Dude, I swear I was so close to saying I had food poisoning." Kyle chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, I almost said I had to go to a funeral. I didn't think he'd see through us that quick." Jake shrugged, laughing nervously. "Hey, we've been friends with him for over a year, right? We've done our part." Kyle nodded. "Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not like we have to go to his family stuff to prove we're friends." "Totally," Jake agreed, though something about the conversation left a bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't as easy to laugh about when he saw David's disappointed face in his mind. "Anyway," Kyle said, standing up, "I gotta head out early today. My girlfriend's dragging me to some farmer's market." "Better than a dinner with David's family, right?" Jake joked, nudging him. Kyle grinned. "You know it." They both laughed, oblivious to how much they just revealed about themselves, not just to David, but to anyone paying attention. As they left the break room, they had no idea what was coming next, or that their casual, cowardly avoidance was about to catch up with them in a way they never could have imagined. As Kyle and Jake walked out of the break room, their conversation quickly shifted from the awkward encounter with David to something they were much more comfortable with, making excuses. "Dude, I'm telling you," Jake said, running a hand through his hair, "if we had agreed to go, it would have been a disaster. Like, I don't even know what kind of food they'd be serving. I can barely handle anything spicier than a jalapeno. And what if they make, I don't know, something super exotic? I mean, what do they even eat?" Kyle nodded emphatically, as if Jake had just dropped some deep truth. "Exactly, man. I was thinking the same thing. Like, what if there's goat or some weird dish we've never heard of? I don't want to be the guy who turns down food at someone's house, but I can't risk it." Jake squinted, deep in thought, as if David's family was planning to serve a 5-course meal of ingredients they couldn't even pronounce. Yeah, What if it's one of those situations where they get offended if you don't eat everything on your plate? I'd end up offending the whole family. He shook his head, clearly satisfied with this new justification. Kyle snickered. Right? And I don't even know what kind of music they'd be playing. I can't just show up and be like, hey, mind throwing on some Coldplay? Jake burst out laughing. Yeah, because that'd go over so well. You'd be the guy asking for Coldplay at a dinner where they probably have something completely different in mind. I mean, what do you even talk about at a dinner like that? What if we don't have anything in common? Kyle shrugged, but the exaggerated way he did it made it clear he was building up the fear in his head more than was necessary. I mean, you know how it is. We're from different worlds. He said the word like he was talking about different planets, not two neighborhoods in the same city. We'd probably end up sitting there in awkward silence just hoping we could leave without looking rude. Jake nodded along. Exactly, bro. We don't want to be disrespectful, but we just wouldn't fit in. It's like cultural differences, you know? Neither of them realized how ridiculous they sounded, spiraling deeper into their own biases. They were completely unaware that what they were really doing was justifying their discomfort with David's family being black. Instead of recognizing their prejudice, they kept trying to frame it as a matter of not fitting in. You know, Kyle added, as if a light bulb had gone off in his head, what if his family asks us about politics or something? I mean, we all know where that conversation's going. Jake grimaced, as if the very thought made him nauseous. Oh man, yeah, I don't even want to go there. Next thing you know, we're stuck in some deep conversation about, like, systemic racism or something. He looked around, lowering his voice as if just saying the words out loud could get him in trouble. I'm all for equality and stuff, but I don't need to have that conversation over dinner, you know? Kyle nodded solemnly, though his eyes were already glazing over as they walked. Exactly. And can you imagine the pressure? We'd be like the only white guys there, all eyes on us. What if we say something wrong? I'm not trying to start a debate during dinner. I'd rather just, avoid the whole thing. Jaka sighed in agreement. Yeah, man, it's better this way. We're just avoiding any awkwardness. It's not like we're racist or anything. We're just trying to avoid a situation where we feel uncomfortable. That's all. He said it with such certainty, as if he truly believed this was about comfort and not prejudice. Kyle slapped Jake on the back. Exactly. We're doing the right thing. No need to put ourselves in a weird situation just because we feel obligated. David's cool and all, but we've got our own vibe, you know? It's just better to keep things separate. Jake nodded again, satisfied that they had successfully rationalized their decision. Yeah, totally. It's just one dinner anyway. It's not like it's going to matter in the grand scheme of things. They walked in silence for a moment, feeling oddly proud of themselves for coming to such a well-thought-out decision. They truly believed they had avoided a potential disaster, never once stopping to consider how their actions might come across to David, or how deeply rooted their discomfort with his family actually was. As they reached the door to the office, Jake turned to Kyle, grinning. You know what? We should just chill at my place tomorrow. Order some pizza. Keep it simple. Kyle grinned back, relief washing over him. Yeah, man, that sounds perfect. No need for anything fancy. They both chuckled, completely unaware of the irony in what they were saying. They had just convinced themselves that avoiding David's family was the better choice, all because they were too uncomfortable to confront their own biases. David, meanwhile, wasn't fooled by their excuses. He'd seen it all before, the uncomfortable glances, the sudden change in plans. But for now, he let it slide, knowing that the real confrontation was coming sooner or later. Because while Kyle and Jake were busy dodging a dinner invite, they had no idea they were heading straight toward an even bigger, unavoidable reckoning, one that wouldn't be as easy to laugh off. That evening, David's house was alive with the sounds of laughter and the savory aromas of his mom's cooking, wafting from the kitchen. The dining room table was already set, plates stacked, glasses filled with iced tea, and a warm casserole dish of mac and cheese sitting in the center like a golden beacon. His family was in full swing, cracking jokes and teasing each other as they prepared for their usual lively Saturday night dinner. David's mom, a tall woman with a smile that could light up a room, bustled around the kitchen with a wooden spoon in hand, stirring pots and checking the oven. "David, honey, can you grab the bread from the counter?" she called, not pausing her rapid dance between the stove and the fridge. David smiled as he walked over and grabbed the bread. His mom was always a force to be reckoned with in the kitchen, turning simple meals into masterpieces. She made every family dinner feel like a celebration. He couldn't help but think of how Kyle and Jake had missed out. "So where are these friends of yours, David?" his uncle asked, plopping down into one of the chairs. "I thought you said they were coming tonight." David gave a small shrug, already knowing the answer. "They had other plans," he said, trying to keep the disappointment out of his voice. He'd half expected them to bail, but it still stung a little. His mom caught the tone immediately and raised an eyebrow. "Other plans?" She wiped her hands on a towel, leaning against the counter with that look, the one that meant she could see through anything. "What kind of other plans?" "Cousin moving, apparently," David said, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. And Kyle said something about a mysterious dairy allergy. There was a brief silence before his sister, sitting at the table already scrolling through her phone, snorted. "Oh, please. That's the lamest excuse I've ever heard. Mysterious allergies? Really?" David chuckled, glad someone else could see the absurdity of it. "Yeah, it was pretty obvious." His mom let out a sigh but didn't say anything more, her smile coming back as she checked on the oven once more. "Well, it's their loss. More mac and cheese for us, right?" She winked, and David couldn't help but smile. The evening unfolded with its usual warmth, the kind that only a close-knit family could generate. His uncle started telling one of his infamous back-in-my-day stories, this one about how he'd tried to impress a girl back in college by joining the track team, only to end up face-planting during his first meet. David's cousin, who was sitting across the table, burst out laughing. "Uncle Mike, you were such a nerd," she teased, shaking her head as everyone at the table laughed along. Even David, who'd heard the story about a dozen times, couldn't help but smile. It was moments like this that made David appreciate his family even more. They weren't just family, they were his best friends, his support system, his source of endless joy and entertainment. And as he sat there surrounded by their jokes and laughter, he realized how different this reality was from what Kyle and Jake had probably imagined. They had pictured something completely foreign, a world they wouldn't understand. But this was just a family dinner, no different from what they probably had with their own families, except maybe a little louder and with better food. His mom interrupted his thoughts as she placed a fresh tray of cornbread on the table, its scent filling the air. "David, honey, don't sit there daydreaming. Pass the bread," she said, laughing. "Sorry, Mom," David replied, smiling as he handed the basket across the table. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned from Uncle Mike's track, fail to his cousin's recent trip abroad, and then to David's mom scolding everyone for not eating enough. "You're all too skinny," she declared, much to everyone's amusement. David sat back, watching his family interact with their usual rhythm. The contrast between this dinner and the one his friends had imagined was almost laughable. All their unfounded fears about not fitting in, about awkward conversations and unfamiliar food, seemed even more absurd now that David was seeing his family through their imagined lens. His aunt, always the comedian, leaned over and said, "Well, maybe next time your friends will grace us with their presence. If they're brave enough to handle my spicy mac and cheese?" She waggled her eyebrows dramatically. David shook his head with a grin. "Yeah, if they can handle it," he replied. But in his mind, he knew better. Kyle and Jake would never get it. They'd never understand how this dinner, this gathering of people who loved and cared for each other, wasn't something to fear or avoid. "More for us," his uncle chimed in, already digging into another plate. As the night wore on, the sound of plates clinking and laughter echoed through the house, filling it with warmth. David's disappointment over his friend's absence slowly faded into the background. He didn't need them to be there to enjoy this. His family was more than enough. By the time dessert was served, a sweet potato pie that could have won awards, David felt a sense of peace. Kyle and Jake had missed out, But it wasn't his loss. It was theirs. They'd never get to experience this side of his life. The love, the joy, the sheer comfort that came with being around his family. Next time, his mom said as they began clearing the table, "Tell your friends they better bring their appetites." David smiled. "Yeah, I'll let them know." He knew that next time would likely come with more excuses, but for now he just enjoyed the moment. Because while Kyle and Jake were busy convincing themselves that they wouldn't fit in, they had no idea how much they were really missing out on. And David? He was okay with that. The next day at work, Kyle and Jake were already waiting for David in the break room, their expressions plastered with what they probably thought were sincere looks of concern and regret. David stepped in, coffee cup in hand, sensing the awkward energy immediately. He knew what was coming. A fresh round of excuses. "David, man," Kyle blurted out as soon as David sat down. "I feel so bad about missing dinner last night. I had this stomach thing, you know?" He placed a hand on his stomach dramatically, as if the ailment had suddenly reappeared. "I think it was something I ate earlier. Dairy, probably. I was so messed up. Didn't want to risk it." David raised an eyebrow, pretending to sip his coffee to hide the smirk creeping up his face. "Right. Because mac and cheese suddenly gives you food poisoning? I've seen you demolish an entire cheese platter without a problem, Kyle. But sure, stomach thing makes perfect sense." "That's rough, man," David said casually, keeping his tone neutral. "Hope you're feeling better now." "Oh, totally." Kyle nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that David wasn't pressing the issue. "Yeah, all good now. But trust me, I was miserable yesterday. I felt terrible about missing it." Before Kyle could dig himself deeper, Jake chimed in with his own grand story, eager to outdo Kyle in the excuse department. "Yeah, and you won't believe what happened with me, David." He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a deep secret. "My aunt, right? She had this emergency, totally out of the blue. I had to drive her to the hospital. Super stressful." David nearly choked on his coffee but kept his face straight. "Your aunt? The one who apparently only exists when you need an excuse? If I recall, she's had 3 emergencies in the past year alone." "Wow, that sounds serious," David said, nodding along. "Is she okay now?" Jake paused, his eyes flicking to Kyle for a brief moment before continuing. "Oh yeah, she's fine. Just, one of those random things. We thought it was worse than it was, but still, had to be there for her. Family, right?" "Sure, Jake. Nothing says family emergency like a last-minute bailout from a dinner you didn't want to go to in the first place." David held his cup steady, listening to Jake's overblown story with a poker face. It was almost amusing to see how much effort they were putting into dodging a single dinner. "I get it," David said, nodding sympathetically. "Family emergencies happen." He couldn't resist adding, "So what exactly happened with your aunt?" Jake blinked, clearly not prepared for a follow-up question. She just had this thing, like a sudden pain in her side." "Yeah." She was really freaked out. David just stared, waiting for Jake to trip over his own lie. "Nice save, buddy. Clearly you're a natural storyteller." "Ah, that sounds scary," David replied, suppressing a grin. "Glad she's okay now." Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, probably realizing how flimsy their excuses sounded in comparison to the truth. "Yeah, so, sorry again, man. We both wanted to be there." "Wanted to be there? You guys were practically dancing with joy when you came up with your escape plans yesterday." David could practically see through their thinly veiled awkwardness. "No worries," David said, keeping his voice light, letting them think they were off the hook. "I figured something came up. My mom did ask about you guys, though. She was wondering where her 2 favorite taste testers went." "Oh, man," Kyle said, wincing slightly. "Tell her I said sorry. I really wanted to try that mac and cheese." He offered a forced chuckle, clearly hoping the conversation would end there. "Right. You mean the mac and cheese you claimed would wreck your stomach?" David's inner dialogue was having a field day, but he kept his expression friendly. Jake, sensing the need to double down, nodded along vigorously. "Yeah, dude, I felt awful. I've heard your mom's cooking is, like, legendary. Legendary enough for you to avoid it like the plague? David thought, barely holding back a laugh. It was almost comical, watching them squirm, each excuse piling on top of the last. But instead of calling them out, David leaned back and shrugged. Well, maybe next time. I'm sure there'll be other dinners. He said it so casually, knowing full well that Kyle and Jake would likely come up with a fresh round of excuses the next time he invited them over. Definitely, Jake responded quickly, as if the idea of next time sent a jolt of panic through him. For sure. Next time. Count me in. Kyle nodded a bit too enthusiastically. Yeah, man, I won't miss the next one. You guys are too much, David thought, giving them both a knowing smile. Cool. I'll let you know when it's happening. As the awkward conversation tapered off, Kyle and Jake both sat back, clearly relieved that David hadn't pressed further. They thought they'd dodged a bullet again, unaware of how transparent they really were. David, on the other hand, had seen right through them from the start. But he wasn't going to force the issue. Not yet, anyway. He'd let them have this little victory for now. But deep down, he knew they'd have to face the truth sooner or later. You can't hide behind excuses forever, he mused, already anticipating their reactions when they'd inevitably cross paths with his family under more formal circumstances. For now, though, he let it slide, knowing that the day would come when their flimsy lies would finally catch up with them. The next few days at work buzzed with excitement and gossip. Kyle and Jake, as usual, were right in the middle of it. Word had spread quickly. Their company was getting a new CEO. Rumor after rumor swirled through the office, each one more outlandish than the last, and Kyle and Jake were soaking it all in. So, what do you think the new CEO is going to be like? Jake asked, leaning back in his chair as he spun a pen between his fingers. Bet it's some big corporate genius. You know, like one of those guys with the slick silver hair, expensive suit, probably went to Harvard or something. Kyle nodded, already picturing it. Oh, for sure. Like some Wall Street guy who's going to come in, give a speech about synergy and maximizing profits, and we'll be on the fast track to success. He mimed a smooth-talking executive, straightening an imaginary tie. Jake laughed. Yeah, definitely. I can already picture it. Some guy who shakes your hand and makes you feel like you're the most important person in the room. He did his best impression of a confident businessman, puffing out his chest. You know the type. Real smooth, probably a workaholic. The kind of guy who gets things done and makes people nervous just by walking into a room. Kyle grinned. Oh, absolutely. But you know, maybe he'll be one of those really intimidating CEOs. Like that type who barely speaks but makes everyone feel like they're doing something wrong just by existing. The kind that doesn't smile. Jake shuddered at the thought. Man, I hope not. I can't deal with that. I already have enough anxiety from our current boss, let alone someone like that. They both chuckled. But there was an underlying excitement in the air. The idea of a powerful new figure coming in had them both curious. They started imagining all sorts of scenarios, fancy boardroom meetings, high-level strategy discussions, and maybe even some swanky company parties. What if this guy's like some millionaire tech dude, Kyle mused, tapping his pen on the desk. You know, the kind who drives a Tesla and does yoga in his spare time. Real progressive, but still all about the bottom line. Jake snapped his fingers. Exactly, like, I meditate every morning, but don't mess up or you'll be fired before your coffee's cold. He laughed, clearly enjoying the fantasy they were building. Kyle shook his head, still grinning. Dude, can you imagine? We'd have to be on our A game all the time. No more sneaking out early or slacking off when the boss isn't around. Oh man, those days would be over, Jake agreed, though the thought didn't seem to bother him as much as it should. But hey, maybe we'll get some cool perks out of it too, like a better break room or, I don't know, free yoga classes. They both laughed, not taking any of it too seriously, but deep down, they were both eager to find out who this new CEO would be. The whole office had been buzzing about it, and there was a sense of anticipation that made the workday a little more bearable. I bet it's going to be someone with, like, Decades of experience in finance, Kyle said confidently. Someone who's run a few companies, maybe even written a book about leadership or something. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Oh, totally. The kind of person who's been in Fortune magazine, you know? Maybe even done a TED Talk. That'd be sick. They continued their back and forth, each trying to outdo the other with more elaborate guesses about the new CEO's background. The more they speculated, the more they built up this idea of some towering corporate giant, the type who would walk in and change everything overnight. They were practically salivating at the thought of impressing this new boss, of getting on his good side right from the start. Whatever happens, we gotta be ready, Kyle said, leaning forward as if they were hatching a plan. We've gotta make a good impression, like, right away. No slacking, no messing around. We gotta look like we're the best employees here, you know? Jake agreed, his face serious for the first time in their entire conversation. Oh, for sure. Gotta be on top of everything. Maybe we'll even get promotions out of this. Exactly, Kyle nodded. This could be our chance to move up. We just need to show this guy we've got what it takes. As they daydreamed about climbing the corporate ladder, neither of them had the slightest clue who the new CEO really was. All their assumptions and fantasies were light years from reality, and the irony of it all was building like a storm cloud on the horizon. Because while they were busy picturing a silver-haired, hard-nosed executive who would whip the company into shape, they were about to find out that their new boss was someone they already knew all too well. David strolled by their desks at that moment, coffee in hand, and gave them a casual nod. "Morning, guys," he said, as if he hadn't just overheard half their conversation. "Hey, man," Jake replied, waving him off, still lost in his CEO fantasies. "Big changes coming, huh?" David smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Oh, yeah," he said smoothly, taking a sip of his coffee. "Big changes." He walked away before they could ask anything more, leaving Kyle and Jake to exchange another excited glance. "What do you think he knows?" Kyle asked, leaning in, suddenly curious. "Who knows? Maybe he's heard something," Jake said, shrugging. "But we'll find out soon enough." Neither of them had any idea just how soon. The day of the big company meeting had finally arrived, and the office was buzzing with anticipation. Kyle and Jake sat side by side, casually sipping their coffees, still caught up in their own fantasies about who the new CEO might be. Every now and then, they exchanged whispered guesses, leaning into their image of the powerful, polished businessman they'd been picturing for days. "Bet he's gonna have one of those deep, commanding voices," Kyle whispered, eyes darting toward the conference room. "You know, the kind that makes people sit up straight the second he talks." Jake nodded, grinning. "Oh yeah, the kind of guy who walks in and the whole room just goes silent." They were so caught up in their imagining that they barely noticed when David walked by and sat a few rows ahead of them, his usual calm and relaxed demeanor intact. "Morning, guys," he said over his shoulder. Kyle and Jake both waved back absent-mindedly, their minds still racing with thoughts of what the new CEO would be like. Just then, the meeting room doors swung open, and the murmurs in the room died down as the HR director stepped up to the front. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice professional but warm. "As many of you know, today is a big day for the company. We are thrilled to introduce our new CEO, a man with a wealth of experience and a deep commitment to innovation and leadership." She paused for dramatic effect, the tension building. Kyle nudged Jake, muttering under his breath, "Here we go. Bet it's some hotshot from Silicon Valley." "And now, without further ado," the HR director continued, her voice brimming with excitement, "please welcome Mr. Samuel Carter." Kyle and Jake's eyes shot toward the door as a tall, imposing figure walked into the room. But instead of the silver-haired corporate mogul they'd been expecting, a well-dressed black man with a commanding presence entered. He smiled broadly at the room, his confidence radiating with every step. Jake blinked, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. "Wait, what?" Kyle's jaw dropped, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. "A black CEO?" he muttered under his breath. "Has the world run out of white CEOs?" Jake, not fully comprehending, leaned closer. "Dude, I didn't see that coming. There must be some mistake. Maybe he's, like, a guest speaker or something? But the HR director's enthusiastic applause and the firm handshake she gave Samuel Carter left no room for doubt. This was the new boss, and as Samuel approached the podium, his voice deep and steady, all of Kyle and Jake's preconceived notions began to crumble. "Thank you for that kind introduction," Samuel began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "I'm excited to be here and to lead this company into its next chapter." Kyle exchanged a panicked glance with Jake, who was now visibly sweating. "Dude, what's happening?" Jake whispered, leaning in. "How did we miss this? There's no way we could have known he was, well, you know." Kyle shook his head slowly, his mind racing. "I don't know, man. I don't know. I mean, there's gotta be more to this. Like, who is this guy?" As they sat there, flustered and trying to wrap their heads around the situation, Samuel continued his speech, talking about his vision for the company, his background, and his plans for the future. Kyle and Jake barely heard any of it. Their brains were too busy whirling with confusion. And then the moment of reckoning came. After the speech, as the meeting transitioned into a casual meet and greet, David stood up and made his way toward the front of the room. Kyle and Jake watched, still in shock, as David approached Samuel, and then, to their absolute horror, Samuel clapped David on the shoulder and gave him a warm smile. "Oh no," Kyle muttered, his face draining of color. "No, no, no. Wait." Jake's mouth dropped open. "Is he—" As if to answer their unspoken question, David's voice rang out clearly, though they barely heard the exact words over the sound of their own panic. "Hey, Dad! Great speech!" Kyle nearly dropped his coffee, his hands shaking so much that a few drops spilled onto his pants. Jake let out an incoherent noise, somewhere between a squeak and a groan. "Dad? Did he just say Dad?" David's dad is the CEO?" Kyle stammered, his brain struggling to catch up. The dinner we bailed on was with the CEO?" Jake, in a daze, suddenly realized he was still holding his coffee cup and quickly set it down before he made an even bigger mess. We dodged dinner with his family?" he muttered, his eyes wide. "Oh man, we really messed up." Kyle could barely speak, his thoughts spiraling. "This is bad. This is really bad. What do we even say to him now?" Jake, clearly still in panic mode, stood up abruptly. "We need to say something. We need to fix this. Now." Without thinking, Jake strode toward Samuel and David, his steps quick and jerky. "Oh no," Kyle whispered, watching in horror as Jake approached them. "This is going to be a disaster." Jake reached them, his face plastered with the most awkward, strained smile imaginable. "Mr. Carter," he exclaimed, his voice way too loud. "Welcome to the company. It's such an honor to meet you." Samuel raised an eyebrow, looking a bit taken aback by Jake's sudden enthusiasm. "Thank you," he said smoothly, shaking Jake's hand. But Jake, in his flustered state, gripped a little too hard, almost pulling Samuel into an awkward half-hug. Kyle, watching from the distance, face-palmed. "He's blowing it." "David's mentioned you two," Samuel said, eyeing Jake and Kyle, who had finally managed to make his way over, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "I was sorry to hear you couldn't make it to dinner the other night." The air in the room felt like it dropped a few degrees. Jake froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Yeah, about that. We had some, personal things come up. Real last-minute stuff, you know. Crazy timing." His laugh was high-pitched and unnatural. Kyle, standing beside him, nodded along furiously. "Yeah, totally. Just bad luck, you know." David stood there, watching the whole exchange, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, too bad," he said, his tone friendly, but with a subtle edge. "Mom was looking forward to meeting you both." Kyle and Jake exchanged panicked glances. They were sweating bullets now, completely aware of how deep they were in the hole, but too far gone to dig themselves out. "Oh, we're really sorry about that," Kyle mumbled, his voice trailing off as Samuel looked between the two of them, clearly unimpressed. No need to worry, Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. There will be other opportunities. His eyes lingered on them for just a second longer than necessary, and the weight of his words hung in the air. The message was clear. They had made a mistake, and he knew it. Kyle and Jake stood there, frozen in place, unsure of how to escape the situation without making things worse. As the tension settled over them, David gave his dad a knowing look, then turned back to Kyle and Jake. Well, David said with a chuckle, guess we'll just have to make up for it, huh? Kyle nodded dumbly. Yeah, definitely. But deep down, he knew they were in way over their heads. As they walked away, Jake leaned over to Kyle, his voice barely above a whisper. Dude, we're screwed. Kyle nodded, still in shock. Completely. Kyle and Jake stumbled out of the meeting, their heads spinning, hearts racing. The big reveal that David's dad was their new CEO had hit them like a freight train. They'd spent the entire morning joking about what the new boss would be like. And now, it was David's dad. The same family they'd bailed on for dinner. The same dinner they'd dodged with the weakest excuses imaginable. Kyle paced in the hallway, rubbing his temples. Dude, what do we even do? We've got to fix this. We have to fix this. Jake, still visibly shaken, leaned against the wall, his hands stuffed into his pockets, like he was hiding from the situation. I don't know, man. I can't believe it. We dodged dinner with the CEO. His voice cracked in disbelief, and he let out a dry laugh that was more panic than humor. How are we supposed to know? Kyle shook his head. It doesn't matter. We've got to do some serious damage control. We can't look like we're just trying to save our butts, though. It has to look genuine. Jake's eyes lit up, and he snapped his fingers. Okay. What if we send, like, an apology gift? Something classy? Maybe a fruit basket? He glanced at Kyle, trying to gauge his reaction. Kyle raised an eyebrow. A fruit basket? Really? We're not sorry his pet goldfish died, Jake. We need something bigger. Jake nodded along, his mind racing. You're right, bigger, like an extravagant fruit basket. You know, the kind with exotic fruits, the kind people don't even know the names of. That'll show we mean business. Kyle stopped pacing and stared at him. Exotic fruits? What are we gonna do? Send them a durian and hope it smells so bad they forget we insulted them? Jake blinked. What's a durian? Kyle waved him off. Never mind, man. Look, we need something better than fruit, something that shows we respect them. Jake's eyes narrowed, his face suddenly serious. Oh, what if we got them wine, like a really expensive bottle of wine? That'll smooth things over, right? Kyle started to nod, then stopped. Wait, didn't David say his family doesn't drink? Something about his dad being really health conscious? Jake's face fell. Oh, right. That's not going to work. He sighed, leaning back against the wall again. Okay, then what do we do? We can't just show up empty-handed. Kyle rubbed his chin, thinking. What if we just come clean? Tell them we didn't know who his dad was? Jake looked horrified at the suggestion. Come clean? Are you insane? That's like admitting we're the worst friends ever. No way. We need to keep this under control. Kyle let out a frustrated groan. Yeah, but whatever we do, it has to look sincere. If we mess this up, we'll be in even deeper trouble. Jake stood up straight, an idea clearly forming. Okay, hear me out. What if we pretend like we didn't show up because we wanted to give them space? Like we knew it was a special family moment, and we didn't want to intrude. Kyle stared at him, blinking slowly. You want us to pretend we're heroes for not showing up? Jake shrugged. Hey, it's better than admitting we made up a stomachache in a fake family emergency. Kyle sighed, rubbing his forehead. I don't know, man. That sounds pretty risky. What if they see right through it? They won't if we sell it hard enough, Jake replied, eyes gleaming with sudden confidence. We just have to act like we were being considerate, like we knew how important family time is. Kyle thought about it for a moment, then slowly nodded. Okay, maybe that could work. But we need to do more than just talk. We need a gesture, something that shows we care. Jake grinned. How about a handwritten note? Real personal. Like, We regret missing the opportunity to bond with your family, but we wanted to give you the space to enjoy each other's company." He spread his hands out like he was envisioning the words on a fancy card. Kyle made a face. "Yeah, and we'll sign it. Best wishes, your considerate, racially oblivious pals." Jake waved him off. No, we'll make it sound legit. And to top it off, we'll throw in some fancy chocolates or something. Everyone likes chocolate." Kyle was still unsure. "Chocolates and a note? You think that'll be enough to make up for everything?" Jake shrugged, his grin fading slightly. "Well, what else can we do? We're not exactly swimming in options here." Kyle sighed again, feeling the weight of their predicament pressing down on him. They were more concerned with saving face than actually confronting what had happened. But that was just the way they operated. Fix the surface, ignore the deeper issues. "Fine," Kyle finally said. "Chocolates, a note, and a whole lot of fake sincerity. Let's just hope it works." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "It'll work. Trust me. People love a good apology gift. We'll be back in their good books in no time." "Yeah, right," Kyle thought. But he didn't say it out loud. He knew they were walking a tightrope, but at this point, there was no going back. They were fully committed to saving their own skins, even if it meant coming up with increasingly absurd ideas. As they headed off to figure out the logistics of their grand gesture, neither of them could shake the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be as easy to fix as they thought. The next day, Kyle and Jake were back at work, nervously glancing around as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. They had already sent the chocolates and handwritten note to David's house. Well, not exactly handwritten, more like printed in fancy script they found online, and they were desperately hoping it would smooth things over. "Think he got the gift?" Kyle asked as they sat down in the break room, his voice low and filled with anxiety. Jake nodded. "Yeah, I checked the tracking. Delivered this morning. So, fingers crossed?" He tried to sound hopeful, but even he knew it was a long shot. They both jumped when David strolled into the room, coffee in hand, a casual smile on his face. "Morning, guys," he said, taking a seat across from them. His eyes flicked between the two, an amused glint in them that made Kyle and Jake instantly uncomfortable. "Morning, David," Jake responded a little too enthusiastically, the edge of panic creeping into his voice. Kyle just gave a weak smile, nodding along. David leaned back, taking a slow sip of his coffee, clearly enjoying the tension in the air. He didn't say anything at first, just let the silence stretch out until it became unbearable. Then, with a slight grin, he broke the ice. "So, how's that dairy allergy, Kyle? Feeling better?" His tone was casual, but the humor in his eyes was undeniable. Kyle nearly choked on his own saliva. Yeah. Way better, actually. It was, a bad reaction. But I'm good now." His laugh was nervous, and he could feel his face heating up under David's gaze. "Oh, God, he knows." "And Jake," David continued, turning his attention to the other culprit, "how's your aunt? I hope she's doing all right after that, emergency." Jake opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a smile. "Oh, she's fine. All better now. Thanks for asking." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands fiddling with the edge of his shirt. "He totally knows." David nodded slowly, letting their excuses hang in the air. "I'm glad to hear it. My mom was really looking forward to meeting you both. She made her famous mac and cheese and everything." He paused, tilting his head slightly. "But I get it. Sometimes things come up, like allergies and aunts." Kyle and Jake both winced at the not-so-subtle jab, but neither of them had the guts to say anything. They just smiled weakly, hoping David would drop the subject. But David wasn't done yet. "So, I got your gift," he said, pulling a small card from his pocket and reading it out loud with exaggerated enthusiasm. "We deeply regret missing the opportunity to bond with your wonderful family and hope this gift shows our sincere apology. Best regards, your considerate friends." He looked up, smiling. "Considerate friends, huh?" Kyle swallowed hard. We thought it was the right thing to do," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "Oh, God, this is going downhill fast." David leaned forward slightly, still smiling, but with an edge in his voice now. You know it's funny. I've never seen anyone so allergic to mac and cheese, especially when they eat pizza 3 times a week. He turned to Jake. And as for your aunt, well, let's just say it was interesting timing. Jake's face flushed. Well, you know, family. It's complicated, he stammered, his brain scrambling for anything to say that might save them from this slow-moving train wreck. David chuckled softly. Sure. Complicated. Allergies, emergencies. I get it. Life happens. He took another sip of his coffee, his eyes still locked on them. But let me be clear. I know why you didn't show up. The room fell silent. Kyle and Jake exchanged a panicked glance, their hearts pounding in their chests. Here it comes. David didn't raise his voice or show any anger. Instead, he kept his tone light, almost amused. I've dealt with people like you before. I know when someone's uncomfortable with things they don't understand. And that's fine, really. I don't expect you to change overnight. He leaned back in his chair, smiling a little. But I do enjoy watching you squirm. Kyle and Jake both sat frozen, their mouths slightly open, unsure how to respond. They had never been confronted so directly, and the calmness of David's words made it all the more terrifying. David stood up, finishing his coffee and tossing the cup in the trash. Anyway, I just wanted to say thanks for the chocolates. My mom loves chocolate, by the way. Great choice. His grin widened, and with that, he turned to leave. Just before he walked out the door, he paused and looked back at them, his voice carrying a hint of mischief. Oh, and by the way, I hope your imaginary allergies don't flare up again next time. We'd hate for you to miss another dinner. With that, he was gone, leaving Kyle and Jake sitting there, staring after him in stunned silence. They didn't know what to say. They didn't even know where to begin. Well, Kyle finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. That went about as bad as it could have. Jake, still pale, nodded slowly. Yeah, we're screwed, aren't we? Kyle let out a long, defeated sigh. Oh, definitely. Kyle and Jake sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty doorway where David had just left. The weight of the confrontation still hung in the air, like a heavy fog neither of them could shake off. They knew deep down that they'd been called out, subtly, calmly, but effectively. And yet, as the silence stretched on, their brains did what they always did, deflected, rationalized, and ultimately downplayed the entire situation. Jake was the first to speak, breaking the tense quiet with a shaky laugh. Well, that was something. Kyle glanced at him, still processing, before letting out a chuckle of his own. Yeah, but you know, I think we handled it pretty well considering. Jake blinked, surprised. Handled it well? Dude, we got grilled. Grilled? Kyle leaned back in his chair, trying to sound casual. Nah, man, he was just messing with us. It's not like we did anything that bad. I mean, sure, we didn't go to the dinner, but look how cool David was about it. He's fine. He didn't even seem mad. Jake hesitated, his brows furrowing, as he tried to reconcile what had just happened with Kyle's dismissal. You think so? I mean, he kind of called us out pretty hard. The whole allergy and aunt thing? He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. That didn't exactly feel fine. Kyle waved him off. Nah, it was all in good fun. He's just busting our chops, man. Besides, we sent the chocolates, didn't we? We smoothed things over. It's not like we had any real reason to be at that dinner. We dodged a bullet. Dodged a bullet? Jake repeated, his face scrunching up in confusion. You really think so? I mean, it was his dad. Kyle shrugged nonchalantly, leaning forward to grab his coffee. Yeah, and his dad seemed fine too. It's not like they're holding a grudge. We just gotta keep doing what we're doing, and everything will blow over. No harm, no foul. Jake stared at Kyle, trying to figure out how he could be so casual about the whole thing. The tension from David's words was still fresh in his mind, but Kyle's relaxed demeanor was starting to make him second-guess himself. Maybe Kyle was right. Maybe it wasn't that big of a deal. I guess, Jake muttered, still not entirely convinced. But things with David feel different now, don't you think? Kyle paused mid-sip, then shrugged again. Nah, it's just awkward right now because of the dinner thing. He'll get over it. We just need to keep it cool, act normal, and eventually everything will go back to how it was. Jake nodded slowly, but the pit in his stomach didn't go away. He could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken tension that now lingered whenever David was around. But Kyle, as always, was quick to dismiss it, chalking it up to temporary awkwardness. I mean, Kyle continued, it's not like we're racist or anything. We just didn't feel comfortable going. And honestly, can you blame us? A big family dinner like that? We probably wouldn't have fit in anyway. It's not like David's holding it against us. He's a chill guy. Jake's lips twisted into a half smile, trying to match Kyle's confidence. Yeah, you're right. David's cool. He's probably forgotten about the whole thing already. Kyle nodded, feeling more assured with every word. Exactly. So no need to overthink it. We'll just keep doing what we do, and everything will go back to normal. He glanced at his watch, then stood up, stretching. Anyway, I've got a meeting. Let's catch up later. As Kyle walked out of the break room, Jake remained seated, staring into his now cold coffee. He wanted to believe Kyle that everything would just magically go back to normal. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something they couldn't just laugh off or ignore. The next few days were a masterclass in awkwardness. Every time Kyle and Jake crossed paths with David, the tension was palpable, but Kyle, in his usual fashion, acted like nothing had happened. He cracked jokes, made small talk, and tried to smooth over any lingering discomfort with his usual bravado. David, however, wasn't playing along. He was polite, sure, friendly even, but there was an edge to his tone now, a subtle distance that hadn't been there before. And while Kyle might have brushed it off, Jake couldn't help but notice the strained interactions. One morning, after a particularly stilted exchange in the hallway, Jake turned to Kyle, his voice low. Dude, I don't know if this is going back to normal like you said. Kyle didn't even blink. What are you talking about? We're good, man. You're overthinking it. Jake shook his head, frowning. I don't know, man. David's been off with us. You can't tell me you haven't noticed. Kyle let out a dismissive laugh. Off? Nah, you're just reading into it. Look, people get busy. He's probably just got a lot on his plate with his dad being the CEO now. Don't stress about it. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about being busy. There was something more, something lingering beneath the surface that Kyle refused to see, or maybe just didn't want to acknowledge. Still, true to form, Kyle continued as if nothing had changed, convinced that their little incident had blown over. He even joked about it a few times, saying they dodged the bullet of awkward family conversations. But every time he laughed, Jake's stomach twisted a little more. Maybe we didn't dodge anything. Maybe we're just too blind to see what we've done. Despite all of Kyle's attempts to brush it off, their relationship with David never quite recovered. They still worked together, still exchanged pleasantries, but the easygoing camaraderie they once had was gone, replaced by something quieter, more distant. David no longer invited them to hang out after work, no longer laughed at their jokes in quite the same way. And while Kyle might have convinced himself that everything was fine, deep down, Jake knew better. He just wasn't sure what to do about it. But like Kyle, he found it easier to ignore the problem than to confront it head-on. It was simpler to pretend that they hadn't messed up, that they hadn't missed an opportunity to bridge a gap they didn't even realize was there. In the end, it was Kyle's final comment, made weeks after the dinner debacle, that summed up their mindset perfectly. Honestly, man, Kyle said one afternoon, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin, we probably dodged a bigger bullet by not going to that dinner. Can you imagine how awkward it would have been? We made the right call. Jake, still conflicted, just nodded along, forcing a smile. Because even though Kyle refused to see it, Jake knew the truth. They hadn't dodged a bullet at all. They'd just fired one straight into their own feet. That's it, everyone. What do you think of Kyle and Jake's journey through their own misguided choices? Did their obliviousness and refusal to grow stand out to you as much as it did for me? It's frustrating, isn't it, when people refuse to see how their actions affect others? Let us know in the comments below which part of their story resonated with you the most. Maybe it was the moment they realized who David's father was, or when they tried to cover up their mess with an awkward gift. Or perhaps it was their complete inability to learn anything from their mistakes. If you've got another tale of race, prejudice, or even an experience of redemption that you'd like us to explore next, drop it in the comments. Your thoughts help shape the stories we bring to life. So don't be shy, share your perspective with us. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay connected for more powerful and thought-provoking stories like this one. Be sure to ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. We've got plenty more stories about real-life situations that challenge the status quo, force us to reflect, and hopefully encourage change. Until next time, remember, staying silent in the face of injustice isn't the answer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, keep the conversation going.